They say with love, you can move mountains. But can we escape the underworld? Hello everybody, and welcome to Maximus, the game analysis channel dedicated to helping you get good. Today we're going to be going over an in-depth beginner guide to Aphrodite's boons and how to use her within your builds. Now Aphrodite is very interesting as a god because she turns you into a very high damage dealing tank when you manage to collect her boons properly. And she actually has some of the most beginner friendly boons in the game that make an immediate impact on your run. So in this guide we're going to start by going over each of her boons individually and then examining 3 sample builds that I have created for you guys. There's a lot to go over, so let's get started. Okay, so we're going to start this guide like we always do on the Hades Wikipedia page. And a couple notes about Aphrodite that I learned just while I was filming this actually. It seems that Supergiant has reduced the Aphrodite boon drop rate. I had a very hard time. I actually played about 10 different builds recording footage for this, and it was really tough to find more than 3 or 4 boons for her. I think the most I ever found was 5 boons, which if you've seen my other guides, usually I managed to find somewhere between 6 and 8. So it seems like Supergiant decided her boons are so powerful that they were just going to reduce the chance of her boons dropping as opposed to reducing their power. This actually puts her in a similar category to Hermes in my mind, where if you see one of her boons, you should always take it. But now let's actually talk about what boons we have on screen right now. Okay, so we start with her 4 basic boons in Heartbreak Strike, Heartbreak Flourish, Crush Shot, and Passion Dance here. And we're going to talk about them all at the same time because they all do good damage and they all inflict weak. Now weak is a status curse that lasts for 3 seconds and reduces the enemy struck by it, reduces their damage by 30%. So this is in addition to your damage reduction when an enemy afflicted by weak hits you. So immediately very strong and has a very significant impact on the game by basically giving you 30% more health so long as you keep weak applied to an enemy. Another point about the Heartbreak Strike and Heartbreak Flourish is that they actually have the highest raw damage increase out of any other boon in the game. So not only are you going to reduce the damage coming towards you when you strike an enemy with them, they are also going to do more damage than any other boon that you can pick up for these. And in a similar vein we have Crush Shot, which actually has the 3rd highest raw damage output among casts, but it also blasts in a small shock wave in front of you when you fire it. So it is useful as a short-range shotgun damage dealer. And then we have Passion Dance as well, which is worth quickly talking about because the damage is not very impressive, but it's a very easy way to apply weak to enemies when you're on a melee focused build, because it means you can take other abilities on your basic attack and your flourish, such as chill or hangover or some such, and still reliably apply weak if you dash around your enemies. The radius is a little small, so it takes a little bit of practice to actually reliably inflict weak with it, but it's still a decent option. I've rated it as probably one of the mid-tier dashes that you can pick up behind Divine Dash and Poseidon's Dash as well. Now we'll spend a few seconds here just talking about Aphrodite's Aid, which is a call that fires a seeking projectile that inflicts charm. And we can see that charm goes from 5 to 6 seconds. And when you level this up, it actually increases the duration of it. Now what's not noted here on the wiki is it actually also does several thousand damage when you fully charge your god gauge before activating the aid. If you check out my let's play that I will link up here in the card, I actually knocked down the last 1/3 of the Hydra's health just by using this call ability. And what's really interesting is, since it does do a few thousand damage in a single instance hit, you can actually stack damage buffs on it to do even more damage with it. For example, if you have Ruthless Reflex and you trigger a near miss, you're going to do another 50% damage, so I believe it does about 2,500 or 4,500 damage when you hit with it, adding 50% to that, and you do 3,750 or 6,750 damage just from a single shot. And there's lots of other ways you can increase the damage of what your call is going to do, so it's actually a very, very solid damage dealer, in addition to turning enemies to your side, making it so that they will attack their allies, their past allies, I should say. And another thing that I really like about it is it will interrupt bosses. It's actually the only ability in the game that will interrupt bosses in the middle of their attacks and will stop them from attacking you for a few seconds. Now, it's not as long as the duration here, because otherwise you could just infinitely chain charm bosses and just kill them really easily. So it's actually about 1 to 2 seconds or so per charm that you afflict to a boss. Moving on to her general buff boons now, we're going to start with a Dying Lament, which is when foes are slain, they damage nearby foes and inflict weak. Now you'll see that the radius over here is pretty small, so foes have to be packed pretty tightly together in order to actually have this boon do anything. Its main use, in my opinion, is for handling the flame chariots in Elysium, and also for the small vermin that swarm you in the Temple of Styx. It doesn't really make a big impact, in my opinion, against all other enemy types, because I find that they're very rarely close enough together to make good use of this, and even when they are, it's only going to do a max of about 80 damage at the epic tier, and applying weak once, as I mentioned earlier, it's only a 3-second curse, so I don't find it very useful. I put this in the low end of boons for her. Next we have Wave of Despair, which is her revenge boon. It's just like every other damage dealing revenge boon, which is whenever you take damage, you damage nearby enemies and inflict your signature curse. Now the damage radius is larger than on Dying Lament up here, but the revenge damage is still pretty low, going up to about 100 damage, and again it applies weak, which is nice, but only lasts for 3 seconds. Which I find is, again, just not that useful. Generally, I don't like revenge boons, and this one, still not my cup of tea, but you can try playing around with it. Okay, so moving on to her better buff boons, we have Different League, which allows you to resist some damage from nearby foes' attacks. Now, I actually like this boon in comparison to Bronze Skin, for example, because it starts at 10% damage reduction and goes up to 15%, and when you level it up, it actually goes up a few percentage points as opposed to a few quarters of a percentage point. I think this is a solid pick. You don't need to take any weak abilities to unlock it, so if you're just looking to add some damage reduction to your build, Different League is a solid boon to pick up. Okay, and now for my personal favorite general buff boon of Aphrodite, Life Affirmation. This boon is fantastic if you find it early, because it increases the amount of maximum health that you pick up as you go through the game. If you find this in Styx and you find it in the epic variety where you get 42% extra health, you are getting an additional about one and a bit centaur hearts for every 2 centaur hearts that you pick up. This is fantastic, and if you find it early, you're basically guaranteed to walk into the final boss with about 300 max health. And in addition, if you find other Aphrodite boons where you pick up weak, that means that you have an additional about 400 health. 400 health total, I should say, because weak is going to prevent 30% of damage coming into you. So this is what I mean by Aphrodite creating very tanky builds, not because she helps you defend like Athena, but because she increases your health and reduces the damage coming into you. If you find this even as late as Elysium sometimes, this can still be very, very powerful. And with that, we're going to move on to Aphrodite's dedicated buff boons, and we're going to start by looking at Blown Kiss, which makes it so that your cast shoots further and is stronger against undamaged foes. Now, I think this is a solid choice. I don't think it's the best choice, but I like it personally because I find that Aphrodite's cast, while very powerful, the short range really inhibits it. And this Blown Kiss actually has a secondary ability, let's say a secondary buff that's not listed here, where it actually increases the radius of her cast as well. So it's actually a pretty solid choice for creating a decently ranged shotgun attack. I don't really care for the damage against undamaged foes, just because I don't think that's a very good buff, but it can be nice, and more importantly, it makes your cast easier to use, which is very important when you're applying Abyssal Blood and Boiling Blood. And if you only have her cast as well, it means you can more reliably apply weak, which, as we're going to see next as we get into the weak dedicated buff boons, is very powerful and also helps you trigger privileged status. So with that, let's move on to our weak dedicated buff boons. Beginning with Empty Inside here, we see that our weak effects can have a longer duration, up to 10 seconds longer, which means we have a 13-second weak effect. This is situationally really great, because if you're taking weak on a slower attack, having it last for longer is going to mean that your privileged status is going to be active for longer, and your damage reduction is going to be active for longer, as well as the other buff boons that you can pick up for weak. So if you're using weak on, say, the Bombard ability, on the Adamant Rail, or even the Nova Smash on the sword, this is a solid choice. I don't think it's the best of the dedicated buff boons, but let's talk about those now before we make any conclusions. And now we're going to talk about Sweet Surrender, which is probably one of my favorite dedicated buff boons, because weak afflicted foes are also more susceptible to damage, and that damage increase ranges from 10 to 25% extra damage, and that is a global damage buff, which I think this is actually the largest global damage buff source that you can pick up in a run, which means that all of your lightning bolts, your hangover, your doom, and your regular strikes are going to do 25% additional damage just for hitting a weak afflicted foe, which is very, very easy to fulfill as a condition, and easily stacks up to privileged status once you stack a second curse on the enemy. So just by having weak, you get a 65% increase to your total damage when you finally trigger that privileged status as well. So I really like Sweet Surrender, especially on my more magic focused builds. And next we are going to talk about Broken Resolve, which I think is probably the single strongest dedicated buff boon in the game. And the reason for that is that it makes your weak effects more potent. And if you take a look at this, it's going to add 10% to 15% damage reduction to your weak effect, which, if you've watched my other content, you know damage reduction normally scales multiplicatively, and this is adding additional damage reduction, which means that if you add 15% from this to your weak's 30%, you actually do have a 45% damage reduction just from 2 boons. So I think this is probably the best source of damage reduction in the game, and if you take, say, the Mermaid Embracer after that for another 30% damage reduction in the front, you actually reach 65% damage reduction total, which, if you take if you take Life Affirmation as well and increase your health, means you are incredibly tanky as you go through your runs. So I really like Broken Resolve as a dedicated buff boon, and recommend that you pick it up pretty much any time that you're taking Aphrodite. Now, if there is one caveat here. If offered the choice between Sweet Surrender and Broken Resolve, judge which one is going to fit your build better. If you are a more high damage magic using build, especially if you're a magic using build, Sweet Surrender I will usually take over Broken Resolve, but in pretty much any other case, Broken Resolve is worth picking up. And finally, we have Aphrodite's legendary boon, Unhealthy Fixation, which to me is tied with Divine Protection for the single best legendary boon in the game. Now, this is because your weak effects also have a 15% chance to charm foes for 4 seconds. This is incredibly powerful, especially if you have taken weak on a fast striking attack, because it basically means that about 1 in 7 attacks is going to completely neutralize your enemy, and they're actually going to fight for you for a few seconds. And this works against bosses, so it's actually very, very strong for killing the final boss and pretty much any other enemy in the game. Tough elite armored enemies go down really easy to this, where you would normally have to dodge around as you chip away at their armor to try and prevent their attacks from getting through to you. You can just hit them a bunch with a weak attack and try to fish for a charm effect, and then stand there and wail on them, and they will do nothing in return to you while they are charmed. This is incredibly powerful, especially since it's really easy to go hit an enemy with a weak effect. I will say, though, that the charm duration is still reduced against bosses, again, just to make it a little bit less broken. And now I'm going to break my own guide rule here, and I'm going to talk about the duo boons from Aphrodite very briefly, just because they are so strong, and I think this is actually one of the key reasons to take her. So briefly here, Curse of Longing makes it so your doom effects continuously strike weak foes, doing 50% reduced damage each time. In combination with the doom dedicated buff boons, this can do a massive amount of damage, especially if you are continually applying your doom effect. Similarly, we have Heartrend, which instead of adding 50% bonus critical damage versus weak enemies, it adds 30%. This number just hasn't been updated yet, which critical effects normally do 2 times damage, so now we're doing 2.3 times damage. So that is a huge increase to your damage effect. And if you want to know more about critical strikes, we'll be going over it in the Artemis boon guide that is coming out very soon. Then we have Parting Shot, which is actually up to a 35% bonus backstab damage for your cast, which can be very, very strong if you are using a cast build, of course, where you have multiple bloodstones and you dodge behind an enemy and just let rip. Cold Embrace is very strong because it gives you a lot of control over your Demeter cast, and it also increases its duration and damage very significantly, which if you also pick up the Demeter boon that adds chill to her cast ability, means you have a focused ice beam that you can very easily target enemies with. And if you pick up Parting Shot as well and you're standing in front of the enemy with a crystal behind them, you're doing 65% additional damage for several seconds while applying chill to an enemy, and this will just melt bosses. It's wonderful. It's excellent. Then we have Low Tolerance, which just lets you stack Hangover more times on weak afflicted foes, which means your Hangover is going to do a ton more damage. Sweet Nectar, this one doesn't look that impressive, but is actually very strong in practice because this bonus level from the palms really quickly adds up. So picking this up early on in a run will really, it's a very noticeable increase in power. And normally I don't like power palms, and I think this actually makes them worth it. And then we have Smoldering Air. Smoldering Air is an interesting one. It's still very strong because it means you're going to be able to use your cast very often, but the type of cast that you have is going to decide how useful this is. So play around with Smoldering Air. It really works well on, of course, Zeus's Call, since it's the Zeus Aphrodite duo boon, but it also works very strong with Athena, Poseidon. It's not so good with Artemis, for example, but anybody who has a very significant effect at a single bar of the God Gauge will benefit a lot from Smoldering Air. Okay, so we broke my own rule there and we talked about duo boons. We're going to move on to builds next because we have a lot to talk about there as well. Okay, so in preparation for this guide, I did 10 runs and I found 3 main ways to run Aphrodite. And we're going to start with the Enchantress build. Now, the Enchantress build is built entirely around using Aphrodite's Call and the variety of buff boons that are available to her in the form of duo boons and also stacking weak effects. Your call ability is used to pick off key enemies in room fights and also to help you disrupt bosses. When you get it to a max gauge charge as well, it can do a huge amount of damage, so it's got a really nice combo effect of stunning and damaging effects against bosses. You can also use your call to pick off key enemies in room fights to make those easier for you. For example, using it to stop a very heavily armored enemy from attacking you so that you can either deal with them safely or use them to distract other enemies. Okay, so we're going to start this build analysis in the End of Tartarus, and we can see I've got a level 2 Aphrodite's Call, a Hangover Dash, and also a Flood Shot. Now, I've picked up the Call a little bit earlier than I would normally want. Normally I want to pick this up towards the end of Asphodel, Star of Elysium, but it was the strongest Aphrodite boon offered to me. And now that I have it, it's really important that we pick up some AoE damage to help us make it through the rooms. Now, I've got the Hades Spear here, and I've also got Flood Shot. So these two abilities, this weapon and this ability, are strong enough to help me get through the regular rooms here, and then I can use my Call to disrupt bosses and do good burst damage against them once it reaches max charge. Now, normally this build, I would say this is a difficult start for it, but I'm already pretty good at killing the Furies, so I was able to make it through here without too much issue anyway. Okay, and now we come to Asphodel, and I've added a Chill Strike to my build, as well as picked up the Refreshing Nectar from Eurydice, because I think it's probably her best upgrade, and I really wanted to make sure that I pick up some good quality boons as I continue through Asphodel. But something odd happened to me, where the randomizer actually didn't give me a single other boon while I was in Asphodel. Fortunately, I did find plenty of health, so I was still able to clear Asphodel, and I just used my call there as well, just to stun one of the melee enemies coming at me. But it did leave me in some dire need of god support by the time I made it into Elysium. But you can see at this point, I'm still able to clear rooms, and obviously I cleared the Hydra and made it into Elysium. So let's jump there next. Okay, so we've made it to Elysium, and we've actually managed to pick up some boons at this point, grabbing an Abyssal Strike, a Quick Recovery, a Hangover Flourish, and then also the duo boon Sweet Nectar, which is going to really help us out as we continue through this build by increasing our overall power level. Now, I grabbed the Drunken Flourish, not because it's fantastic on the spear throw, but because I wanted a reliable way to trigger privilege status as I go through the underworld. And Abyssal Strike was the natural choice to take because my basic attack is currently my main form of damage, and I really could use a little bit more punch on it. And as a side note here, I realized that with the spear spin attack, particularly the Hades one, which has a much larger spear spin attack, you can actually hit enemies through walls, which is very helpful as I go through this, as I don't really want to be peppered by these archers while I do my best to kill them. Now, this build is still a little bit far from complete. We'll see the completed one as we go into Styx here, but I'm still actually able to handle all of these archers that are coming at me, despite them being armored. So this is still a fairly strong build, as we will see going into Styx now. Okay, so now we come to the final stages of the build, and you can see I've finally found another Aphrodite boon after looking for it the entire game in a different league, just for a little bit more defense as we go forward here. I've also picked up Greatest Reflex for some very much needed mobility at this point, and then also a Blizzard Shot to give me a little bit more damage and a second source of the chill status effect. And you can see against regular room enemies, I'm very effective with this build because I very quickly trigger my privileged status, and I'm able to kill them pretty safely, especially in Styx here with my Flood Shot, meaning that I can just knock enemies into walls as I need them to, and do a little bit of bonus damage with my Hangover as we go along as well. And here we go, we have our final completed build, and we can see I've picked up a very late exclusive access, which has given me an epic Hyper Sprint, which in combination with the Quick Recovery and the Greatest Reflex is what eventually carries us through the final boss. This is a very strange run. You can actually see I'm about 4 or 5 boons short of where you would normally be as you're going through this, but I'm still able to get through it by using my call and my dashes very smartly. And again, I really focused on building up a strong late game boon set despite not having that many boons. So this is kind of the strength of the Enchantress, where you can come back in the late game even if you have had some bad luck up until then, because you should have enough passive buffs that the rest of your build is strong enough to carry you through to the end, especially if you pick up the Dash Suite from Hermes. And now we've reached the second build of this guide, which I lovingly call the Secret Boyfriend Living in Canada. Now you may wonder, why in the world would you call it that? Well, it's because we use Chill, Weak, and then either Doom or Hangover to destroy our enemies. And the logic's very simple. As the enemies coming closer to Zagreus, we chill them. As they get nice and close to Zagreus, we weaken them. And then when they're ripe for the kill, we show them the cost of living in Canada and they just die. But joking aside, let's take a look at the build here. And we can see we have a very strong high damage build starting with Doom on our basic attack, Chill on our flourish, and Weak on our cast. So right away in Tartarus, we actually have the ability to apply privileged status, as well as we can slow enemies down with Demeter and make it easier to approach or avoid them while using the bow. And we also have our Weak Shot in order to prevent the tougher enemies from doing too much damage to us. These three abilities are actually pretty much exactly what I would want on a bow build, since Doom acts so well on the regular bow shots and such a slow attack, and chill is so fantastic on the special of the bow. In addition, because I have the Hera bow, I can also launch Aphrodite's cast ability, which gets around the short range effect of it, which really has created a very strong build right away, and is going to form the core of our secret Canadian boyfriend as we're going forward. And now that we're in Asphodel, we can see we've continued to build up our Doom damage with a impending Doom, and we've also added a Hyper Dash because Hyper Dash is just really, really solid. Now between Chill and Aphrodite, we actually have enough defense, so I'm really focusing on just pumping out my offense more and more as we go forward. And I really like taking the impending Doom on the Doom ability here, because it means that my privilege status is even easier to trigger, because now my Doom effect, which does count for privilege status, lasts longer. So the more attacks I hit with, the more damage I'm going to be doing overall. This is a very, very powerful build at this point, as you can see me pretty easily clearing these rooms without too much issue. Even the heavily armored enemies in here of the, I think they're called Bone Berserkers, something like that, they stand pretty much no chance against this Hera bow at this point, especially since I can avoid them with my hyper sprint. And now that we're moving into Elysium, we can see I've actually added a Poseidon Dash for a last little bit of control, and I've also picked up some Demeter boons just to help me with a little bit more damage, since Winter's Blast is going to make it so that when I stack multiple chill effects over 10 on an enemy, it creates a nice blast effect, which with the amount of shots that my bow special is putting out is pretty easy for me to trigger. This is pretty close to a perfect build at this point in my opinion, because the dash allows me to break up enemies and keep them away from me, which is really key with the bow, especially when I already have Doom and Chill and Weak on them, which is just going to really quickly melt them, especially since I can continuously apply Doom at range to make sure that they go down when I want them to. And the nice thing about the Chill effect here is because I have the, I think it's additional 4 shots on the special attack of the bow, I can melt heavier enemies much faster as well. So jump close, knock them back a little bit, then launch my Doom strike with a loaded crush shot on it because of the Hera bow, and then jump close again, try and hit them against the wall, and finish them off with a flurry of chill shots. Okay, now we're in Styx, and this is very nearly our completed build. And we can see that I have added another Doom buff in Dire Misfortune. I've picked up Ravenous Will. I've actually picked up a Chaos Boon as well that is making my crush shot better because I've got an additional Bloodstone. I've increased the reload speed of my Bloodstones from Hermes, and I've also made it so that the first strike of my cast against an enemy without a Bloodstone in them is going to do an additional 50% damage from Hermes. And finally, you might have seen it there really quick, I also picked up the duo boon Curse of Longing, which I mentioned earlier in the boon section of the video, which in combination with a longer boon timer and the ability to stack Doom damage with Dire Misfortune, we have a very strong punching Doom effect that absolutely melts enemies. And looking at our completed build here, this Doom Strike is now so powerful in combination with our various other curses that it's really easy for me to go through this door here and just completely and utterly wreck the boss. So, of course, me being a Canadian, I make the Canadian build one of the stronger ones. You know, no bias there. But overall, this was a much luckier build, and I really picked up the boons and abilities that match the weapon very closely. So it's really just a lesson in picking the correct boons for the weapons and knowing what you're trying to do with stacking statuses and taking good advantage of your abilities and shaping your playstyle around, well, the abilities that you're getting in Chill, Doom, etc. But enough of this one, let's move on to the next build. So this build I call the Hippie with the Knife because it's all about using Aphrodite and Artemis together to produce a very tough and very, very, very high damage build. So the main idea is to use Artemis as our main source of damage and pick up a single weak ability just to reduce incoming damage in somewhat so that we can better easily tank enemies because normally Artemis is a very, very fragile build. Also, we want to try and pick up the duo boon between Artemis and Aphrodite because it's going to add an additional 30% to our critical effects. And really quickly, critical I think I mentioned it earlier in this video. It makes it so that a regular critical, you do 2 times damage with your ability that's doing a critical, and that includes any buffs on top of it. So if you have an 80% buff on a 50 damage attack, you're going to do about 60 damage, 70 damage, and then when you critical, it's going to do about 140 damage. When you take the dual boon, that adds another 30% on top of that. So the math is pretty hard in my head, but it should work out to be about probably about 160, 170 damage total with that additional dual boon, and that only gets better and better the more increases to damage that you stack on your attack with crit chance. This is personally my favorite way to play Aphrodite because you're really focusing on taking the physical damage boons, all the different combat tricks, and deflect and knockback, blah, 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 which is much more reliant on player skill, and I really find a satisfying way to play the game. So on to the actual run itself here. I got really lucky going through the start of this, where I picked up a epic Heartbreak Flourish, and also the Spear Launcher early on, which gave me a very strong ranged attack to deal damage with, as well as starting off with an Artemis boon in pressure points, just to help make it so that when I get lucky, I'm going to do a lot of damage. And you can see I've also picked up the Lightning Strike from Zeus. I picked that up because I really was hoping to replace it with an Artemis Strike later on, and I wanted to make sure that if I did find that Artemis Strike, it would have to be a higher rarity than Epic, so of course a Heroic tier, which would really help me out, especially if I can find it at the start of Elysium or even at the end of Tartarus here. But if you pay attention to the gameplay here, you can see that my Flourish is actually strong enough that it's killing pretty much every enemy in one hit. We're doing enough damage that I can just dash in and finish them off with a quick poke attack. And I did mention this in the Boon section of the game, Boon section of the video, pardon me. Aphrodite's Flourish and Strike actually have the highest raw damage out of any in the game, which makes her particularly suited for stacking with Artemis, and also with the various Daedalus hammers and such to create very high damage attacks right away. And just really quick, in our second clip here in Tartarus, you can see I found my Heroic Crit Strike from Artemis. So this build is very well on its way, and I basically walk into this Fury fight and just melt them. It's wonderful. So since I'm sure you don't want to watch me kill the Fury Sister again, instead we're going to jump ahead to Asphodel here, where we can see I've added a Chaos Health boon, a Chaos increased rarity chance of boon drops, and also a greater haste from Hermes, just to make it so I can move around the battlefield a little bit easier. And we're going to walk into an elite combat here and just utterly melt both of these elite combatants very easily. And you're going to see I'm going to just stand back and use my weak Flourish to do some good range damage, and then I'm really going to get in there, especially with the Hades boon on, the Hades buff on, which is a 150% increase to your basic strike and your ranged Flourish, and these backstabs and critical hits are going to do a ton of damage on this Gorgon. And you're going to see in just a second here, I think I get behind her and she goes down in about 2 hits. And one, nope, come on, there you go. Well, I'll just kill her with the Flourish then. This guy, yeah, there we go. 359 damage hits right there. And then we also decide to pick up a Hunter's Mark here, just because we want to get really reliable criticals to help us get through these regular rooms. Okay, so now we've reached Styx and almost the end of this build. You can see I've added some backstab damage from Chaos, and I've also grabbed a Hyper Sprint from Hermes. But more importantly, we've actually found 4 more boons from Aphrodite. Again, this is the most boons that I found from her in a single one of these runs, picking up 2 duo boons in Parting Shot, and there's our additional crit damage against weak enemies as well. And we also found her legendary in Unhealthy Fixation, and we also found the Sweet Surrender boon as well, which is again just stacking some more damage on our basic strike to make it so that our criticals do even more damage. And what's really nice is that with the Unhealthy Fixation, as you can see in a whole ton of these fights, I'm going to use right there And I use my flourish attack and completely stop an enemy from attacking for several seconds, which is really useful here, especially as we get towards the end of the fight. Again, I charm this guy and he stands there and lets me wail on him, which is especially convenient with the additional crit damage, because it means that, well, they're not going to hit me, and I can just stand there and fish for crits the entire time. And now, just to show you the strength of this build, I decided to jump forward to the end of this chamber route and show you me fighting this elite combat here, which is normally very challenging. But you see, I was able to get right in there, throw an unhealthy fixation on the snake stone, and get some good crits in. So I've already got his armor down, and now it's just a case of keeping him stunned while I kill him. And you see greater haste and hyper sprint really coming into their own, letting me just maneuver around the battlefield very, very rapidly. Of course, the satyrs are still hitting me just because it's very challenging to avoid their ranged attacks, much to my frustration. Hunter Mark really helping us out by actually making it so we crit a lot more often, and we also did pick up a level 2 pressure points, so that is also raising our crit chance and helps us get through this room no problem at all. And here we have our completed Hippie with a Knife build. And you can see we've actually picked up a few more Artemis boons here. We grabbed the right there, Hunter Instinct, which gives you faster God Gauge when you inflict a critical hit. And we've also actually picked up Clean Kill, which is adding another 30% crit effect to our criticals. So all in all, against a weak enemy, we actually have an additional 80% crit damage for a total of 2.8 times total damage against our enemies. And I very easily go through this fight and just melt the final boss once again, because Artemis and Aphrodite they combine so very well together. So just wrapping up everything we've talked about in this video, we can see that Aphrodite can either create very tanky builds, very high damage builds, or really she can fit into pretty much any other run you have going. And that's because weak is very, very effective even if you only ever find one boon from her, and it really fits into any build for triggering privileged stats and just a really big damage reduction, as well as the fact that her other abilities of Charmed are just so powerful for taking down really tanky enemies and even bosses. It's really nice since it's the only ability in the game that can actually stun them and stop them from attacking for a few seconds while you get some cheap hits in. And this can really be summarized in the 3 main building techniques for Aphrodite. You can take her as the Enchantress, where you pick up her call and focus on trying to get other buff duo boons from her as you go through your runs, which creates a very strong build overall, with her call on hand to help you neutralize tougher enemies and also give you an upper hand against bosses. I will say that this build is a little bit hard to get off the ground for beginner players, but once you become more comfortable with clearing Tartarus and Asphodel, it does become easier and is a very strong build to walk into the final boss with. Or we can go for the Stacking Curses Canadian Boyfriend build, which, being Canadian myself, I find very amusing and is also very strong if you manage to put the correct curses on the correct attack. Now, most curses require you to hit multiple times for them to be effective, but Weak and Doom are also very good on your slower attacks. So this build really fits onto any weapon set and gives you a lot of control over the battlefield, and it's very easy for you to trigger privileged stats as well for a 40% damage increase. So I really enjoy this build. I kind of consider it the magic-based build for using Aphrodite, and I highly recommend trying it out. It's more of an intermediate level build because you really need to know what kind of boons you can expect as you go through your run, and really what boons stack well on which weapon attacks, especially if you start switching up your aspects, because that does actually change which boons work well on each attack for your weapon. And finally, we have the Hippie with a Knife build, which is just hyper aggression, you taking every single physical damage boon that you can find, and just going all in on killing the enemies as quickly as possible, and using Aphrodite to help you tank the damage coming back at you. Picking up Life Affirmation is going to help you, obviously, because you're going to have more health, and having that single weak boon is also very powerful as well for, again, increasing your effective health. And it also will unlock the Heart Rend Duo boon, which adds 50% additional critical effect to your critical hits, which is a massive damage boost if you have correctly built a critical damage attack. This is, again, sort of an intermediate build. It's probably a little bit harder than the Canadian Boyfriend build, but that's only because it relies more on player skill, but it is very satisfying to play because it really requires you to have a good understanding of how the boons work and also the different timings of each ability and enemy attacks. Give it a shot. You'll probably really enjoy playing this style, especially if you're a fan of Artemis like I am. So really quickly talking about tips for beginners and advanced players. As a beginner, you should pretty much just always take Aphrodite whenever she's offered because all of her boons are really solid. I will say that her cast is a little bit tricky to use as a beginner just because it has such a short range, but it is also very powerful and can hit multiple enemies in front of you. Similarly, her dash is a little bit trickier to use just because the radius that it does damage in is a little bit smaller, so you gotta dash right up against enemies, so you gotta know attack timing a little bit or already be using a melee weapon, so you're already gonna be up close and personal with the enemies. But definitely take her as a beginner. She'll help you get further just in making you tougher. For our advanced players, you really want to just try and get weak on any attack or any ability that you can, and that's because you want to unlock her duo boons as soon as possible because they are so very strong, especially if you can also get her legendary ability and start charming your enemies and charming bosses. You're going to find you're going to have a very easy time completing your runs, and if you can pick up her buff duo boons from Poseidon, for example, as you're going through the run, you're going to have a very strong build by the time you reach the final boss. Overall, Aphrodite seems to be about on par with Hermes with the strength of her boons, where she's got some boons that are, you know, middle tier, but then the rest of her boons are really high tier. They're very strong overall, which explains why it seems to me like Supergiant has reduced her boon drop rate to try and account for that, because if you get a whole ton of her boons, it becomes very easy to then go and clear the underworld. Have you guys found that Aphrodite seems to pop up less often for you, or do you have some builds with her that you really enjoy that you don't think I quite covered well enough in this video? Please leave them in the comments down below for any other beginners who come to learn about how to use Aphrodite. I really appreciate you guys trying to really just help everyone else get into this game. And of course, thank you so much for watching. I will see you guys in the next video, and remember, there is no escape.